air in the office of Sterling and Red on the 42nd floor of the Atlas Tower was always still, always cold. The kind of stillness that precedes a storm, or perhaps the kind that follows the perfect, irreversible crime. This is where Arthur Vance, a man whose entire life was built on columns of debit and credit, made his final, most devastating mistake. Arthur wasn't a criminal in the way we usually understand it. No violence, no weapons, but his quiet, almost imperceptible crime was one of ultimate betrayal. The betrayal of trust, the betrayal of responsibility, the betrayal of the very mathematical truth he swore to uphold. He was a certified public accountant, 47 years old, with the calm, unremarkable face of a man who dealt in certainties. But behind the crisp collar and the controlled gaze, a deep-seated panic had been growing for 4 long years. It began small, a single misallocated transfer to cover a minor quarterly shortfall in a client's portfolio, the kind of internal borrowing he told himself was temporary. He would replace it next week, when the market corrected. But the market did not correct. It began to tilt, and Arthur, instead of confessing and absorbing the professional and personal collapse that awaited him, chose the one path that seemed, in the moment, less painful. Concealment. The client was Gantry Innovations, a regional tech firm whose founders trusted Arthur. They didn't see the trembling in his hands when he presented the annual reports, the reports he had spent weeks meticulously fabricating. He wasn't just juggling numbers. He was building an entirely invisible financial universe, the shadow ledger, as the investigators would later call it, a system of offshore shell corporations and intricate false transactions designed to keep the main Gantry balance sheet looking robust, healthy, profitable. In truth, Gantry Innovations was dead. Arthur's initial borrowing had snowballed into a $50 million black hole. The money was gone, vanished into a network of phantom investments that were never real, used to cover old debts, to maintain the fiction. Arthur's motivation wasn't greed, not entirely. It was fear. Fear of professional ruin, fear of disappointing his wife, Eliza, fear of losing the status that was the only armor he had ever known. One Friday afternoon, the facade began to crack. A junior analyst at the regional bank, a diligent woman named Marta Rodriguez, noticed an anomaly. A large, non-standard wire transfer from Gantry Innovations routed through a small, unidentified firm in the Cayman Islands. It was flagged as operational capital, but the size and the routing path a perfect storm of red flags. Martha didn't panic. She escalated. This simple action, the fulfillment of a professional duty, was the first domino in Arthur Vance's undoing. When T-Bunk's internal fraud department contacted Gantry's CEO, Elias Gantry, the first person Elias called was Arthur. Arthur's phone rang precisely at 4:53 p.m. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing the final, beautiful lie of the shadow ledger. The phone on the glossy mahogany desk seemed to scream with alarm, though the ringtone was a gentle chime. Arthur stared at it, the blood draining from his face, leaving a pale mask of guilt. He knew. This was it. He picked up. His voice, measured and low, was a masterful performance. Elias? What is it? Elias? Gruff and agitated? Explained the bank's query. Arthur listened, breathing deeply, every nerve ending, screaming a warning. He offered a practiced, calm response. It's a standard treasury movement. Elias? A new diversification strategy we discussed last month. They're mistaken. I'll call their head of security right now and clear it up. The lie came out clean, perfectly formed, but the internal tension was immense. He swallowed hard. The breath he took was ragged, shaky. Elias accepted the explanation. His trust in his CPA still absolute, but a subtle seed of doubt had been planted. Arthur knew he had bought himself hours, perhaps a weekend, but the entire house of cards was now swaying violently. That night, Arthur didn't go home. He went to his secondaris, smaller office in an industrial park, the bunker he used to manage the off-books accounts. The room was sterile, fluorescent lit, smelling of old coffee and fear. He spent the entire night, from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m., frantically working, not to fix the problem, but to create a final, impenetrable layer of defense. He shredded documents, wiped hard drives, and, most crucially, created a final, complex set of transactions designed to pin the entire financial collapse on a former deceased partner of Sterling and Reed. It was an act of final desperation, a terrible moral compromises, sacrificing the dead to save the living, or at least, to save his own freedom. At 7:30 a.m., Arthur finally drove home. He found Elisa awake, sitting in the kitchen, not with coffee, but with a single, unopened letter on the counter. It was a formal, registered letter from the Federal Regulatory Task Force. FR, addressed to Arthur Vance CPA. Elisa looked up at him, her eyes wide, betraying years of suppressed anxiety. She had known something was wrong for Munsies the late nights, the sudden, sharp agitation, the way he would flinch whenever his phone rang after 6 p.m. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice tight with terror and sorrow. "What have you done?" Arthur didn't answer. He walked past her, his gaze locked on the letter. "Ettore, et opene," was a formal subpoena. The bank had contacted the regulators. The timeline was now minutes, not days. He had lost. He looked at Eliza, his face a ruin of guilt and exhaustion. In that moment, the carefully constructed facade of the successful man finally shattered, revealing the hollow, terrified individual beneath. His entire body sagged. He leaned on the counter, his hands, usually so steady with a calculator, trembling violently, knocking over a crystal vase. The silence in the kitchen, broken only by the sound of glass shrapnel, was deafening. He knew he had to confess, not to the authorities, but to the person he had hurt the most. The interrogation room for the FRTF was Spartan. A steel table, 3 chairs, a camera pointed at the subject. Arthur was sitting opposite Agent Lena Ortiz and Agent Marcus Clay. Ortiz was sharp, clinical, focused on the figures. Clay was the psychological pressure point, watching Arthur's body language, his breathing, his The tension was palpable. The air was thick, heavy, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. The case against him wasn't based on physical evidence, but on a trail of numbers that spoke a language of devastating deception. "Mr. Vance," Agent Ortiz began, her voice calm, professional, and entirely devoid of judgment. "We've reviewed the gantry accounts, specifically the transfer on the 23rd of last month to Argos Holdings in the Kama. Explain the nature of that transaction." Arthur was prepared. He launched into the prepared narrative about the deceased partner. The pre-authorized high-risk investment fund that was now performing poorly. Clay leaned forward slightly, not speaking, just applying a physical weight to the situation. Arthur felt the sweat prickling the back of his neck. He swallowed. The lie felt solid, practiced, but it was hollow. Ortiz was relentless, calmly presenting evidence, bank statements, emails, and, most damningly, a personal note from Arthur to himself, hidden in a seldom-used directory on his laptop, detailing the original, unauthorized transfer. The moral pressure was building, a physical force pressing down on him. Arthur began to falter. His eyes darted everywhere but to the agents. He started massaging the bridge of his nose. It was a highly aggressive strategy, Agent. "I was trying to cover the initial shortfall. I never meant for it to get this far." The admission, forced out of him, was quiet, almost a whisper, but it hung in the air like a thunderclap. The guilt, years in the making, finally found its release. The subsequent investigation revealed the full extent of the fraud, the $50 million gone, the company ruined, hundreds of employees losing their pensions. Arthur Vance's trial was a public spectacle, a lesson in white-collar crime and the disastrous consequences of ethical drift. He was found guilty on all counts. But the true punishment was not the 15 years he received. It was the look on Eliza's face when she finally understood the depth of his lies, the look of profound, irreparable disappointment. In that moment, he saw not just his crime, but his own moral bankruptcy. The story of Arthur Vance is not just about a large sum of money. It's about the invisible architecture of trust and how a single, flawed, human decision, motivated by fear and pride, can systematically dismantle it until nothing remains. He gambled his life, his family, and his freedom on a lie. And the ledger of his life finally came due. Sometimes, one wrong choice can destroy a lifetime. Learn from their story. Choose kindness. Choose life. This was just the beginning. The most mysterious and shocking crime stories are still ahead. Subscribe to Crime Flow Narratives and be among the first to uncover what comes next.